Yeah. I kind of feel like Madonna in this headset, so anyways. So good evening, everyone. And I just wanted to open up by saying thank you again to Mark Mayer and the Asian Art Museum for inviting me to organize this conversation between some of my favorite artists who have become close friends over the years, actually. These are some of the most exciting artists that I've seen working in the Bay Area now, or anywhere else in that matter, and I'm really excited that we have Michael Arcega, Eliza Barrios, Jenifer Wofford, Cece Carpio, and Lordy Rodriguez joining us tonight, and there will be a slideshow of all their work. So if you're not familiar, you can pay attention to that eventually. So yeah, this is an immense and exciting opportunity for us tonight to hear about their varied practice and processes, and hopefully we get even some puns from our resident punster, Mike Arcega. No promises. So to begin tonight's conversation on the state of Filipino American art in the Bay Area, I wanted to actually, this isn't a lecture, but reflect on the work and life of the late Carlos Villa, a Filipino American artist, curator, teacher, and collaborator who was born and raised in San Francisco and who unfortunately left us in 2013. This semester, I actually had the opportunity to teach a course, an art history course, centered on Carlos's life and practice at the San Francisco Art Institute, where he actually went to school himself and where he taught for the better part of 3 decades, studio classes in sculpture, painting, mixed media, as well as collaborative courses alongside local arts nonprofits and institutions like the Luggage Store Gallery, and the Tenderloin National Forest. In that class, what I pushed my students to consider were these following questions that I think can actually help guide our inquiry tonight, for these artists tonight, actually. The questions I asked my students were, how do we situate Carlos Villa within the genealogy or history of contemporary art in the United States? And is it useful, when is it useful to consider Villa as, quote unquote, this Filipino American artist? So in terms of our conversation tonight, what I want to think about in relation to these artists here is, how can we talk about all of their work as part of this larger trajectory of Filipino American art, and I use that term pretty loosely, but also how can we talk about that in relation to contemporary art in the Bay Area more widely? 2 things in terms of how folks, right, whether they be academics like myself in Asian American studies and art history, as well as in other activist-oriented kind of discussions of Filipino American art, these are 2 trends that I've seen in terms of how we talk and think about this category of Filipino American art. One was in terms of identifying the background of the maker, right? The artist is Filipino American or Filipino diasporic, and or their subject matter is in relationship to particular moments in history, right, related to the Philippines and its diaspora. So whether that's the Philippine-American War, the experience of Filipino farm workers in California and the West Coast, there's Carlos, or the plight of domestic workers and other women since the 1960s. That's the first way, right? So an identity-based politics, a history-based politics. And the second way of talking about Filipino-American art as a category is more thematic, right? Again, work that could be more conceptual, but is fixed on a certain set of themes, whether that's immigration, anti-Asian racism, the model minority myth, and stereotypes of Filipinos as doctors, lawyers, professionals, nurses, not artists, that is to say. These are the 2 general ways of how people have talked about Filipino American art. And when we actually look at Carlos Villa's output and his life story, it kind of troubles those narratives. It doesn't really conform to either of those. And that's why I use his work as a kind of model of thinking differently about Filipino American art, and how I actually think these artists tonight help us also think differently about Filipino American art. So a little bit about Carlos Villa, who was, again, born and raised and passed away here. I was shocked when I started researching that no one's really written so much about him, and so many of us here in the Bay Area don't know him, even though he's, was working here for close to 50 years. So Carlos, in his heyday right there, he was born to a Filipino father and mother of the Manong generation, which is the first generation of Filipinos, right, recruited by the US to work in fields, canneries, and up and down the West Coast in Hawaii. He was raised, however, in the Tenderloin, which at that time was primarily a Latino and Black neighborhood, a working class and poor neighborhood, right, similar as it is now. And he identified much more strongly with the working class Black and Latino communities there than perhaps with other Filipino Americans. Part of that is because he was one of the only children Filipino, full-blood Filipino children raised in that neighborhood, the Manongs were not really able to marry. Many of them were bachelors because of restrictive immigration rules. So he had a lot of uncles who were of this generation, but he himself, again, grew up in a more multicultural working class neighborhood. When he went to the California School of Fine Arts for his BFA, he was told that there was no such thing as a Filipino American art history. And so for the rest of his practice, he did spend some time in New York where he did more kind of abstract expressionist works. He was trained by leading Bay Area ABEX people like Elmer Bischoff, David Park. But when he returned to San Francisco in 1969, of all years, this is when he really began his investigation of what he wanted to create in terms of producing new forms of Filipino art history himself. And what's really important to know about his work is that really iconic pieces of his, such as Tattoo from 1969. This is a photograph that he drew himself with ink after it was already developed. Pieces like Second Coat from 1970 that he actually wore in a ritual performance called Ritual. I'll just go through some of these pieces. The Artist's Feet, another iconic work from 1979. That was a performance piece where he actually donned the coat and a mask before stripping naked and making an abstract expressionist painting with his body. Through his later works in the 1990s, such as My Uncles, and his last show here, from Manong, Some Doors, and a Bouquet of Crates that was shown at the Mission Cultural Center. Across all of this practice, what I want us to think about are the ways that, in one part, they could be seen as an excavation of history, and memory of the Manong generation and other Filipinos in the US. But so many other of these works are about imagination and creation, producing new forms of thinking about Filipinos in the United States for the future, So I talk about these as speculative pieces or sci-fi pieces in some ways, that are really kind of trailblazing a new path for Filipinos in the US that aren't so tied to old histories and old narratives. In terms of, again, thinking about Carlos Villa's life and practice as a model of imagining Filipino American art differently, one thing I really want to stress are the multiple avenues through which he expressed his vision. So not only through his individual art practice and performance works, Carlos was deeply invested in collaboration, teaching, and curation. Access stressed the development of what he called street scholarship, and which was produced not only for insular or isolated ethnic communities, but for all of the people of San Francisco, across gender lines, racial lines, class lines, and communities. So some of the highlights of his career in terms of this collaborative work, slideshows, other people's stuff, here we go, include pioneering Filipino Americans art classes that he taught at SFAI and USF, which later became called the Worlds in Collision class, and then incorporated community-engaged projects facilitated by Lori Laser and Daryl Smith of the Luggage Store. He's also well known for his series of symposia. Here's one of them. Other Sources, an American Essay from 1976. He had a whole series of symposia held between the 1970s and early 2000s that brought together really hundreds of artists of color, queer artists, and female artists to talk about their work and showcase it, and to really dialogue this around questions of multicultural art and representation in the larger art world. So he was really actually central for big conversations that were later to replan a national stage, such as the 1993 Whitney Biennial. What was happening here in San Francisco actually predates that by 20 years, and he was super central to organizing these venues for dialogue. Other major works. So he was also part of and considered part of larger communities such as the Mission School in the 1970s in terms of his collaborations with them. These are some of the artists that were featured in his early symposia. He's also invested in this we really see in 1994 with the larger struggle in San Francisco against gentrification to save the International Hotel in Manila Town. And as we know now, this isn't a problem that's gone away, but it's ever increasing. And Carlos was deeply concerned and interested in supporting other community-based artists from Kearny Street Workshop and elsewhere in really supporting the arts and activist art against gentrification. So in 1994, Carlos did this show. He curated this show. Eliza was part of it back in 1994 at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. It was the first Filipino American contemporary art show, I believe, in the country, and definitely in San Francisco, in such a large venue. This YBCA was brand new at this point. It had barely been open for a year. This installation that he curated clearly draws on the history of the Manongs again, highlighting the I-Hotel struggle, and also he did a really amazing job of featuring and incorporating emerging artists, new contemporary artists on the scene, again, such as Eliza and the Diwa Collective. So because of this action and others, it's really hard for me to place Carlos's work and his life into a singular kind of box, right? Into singular frameworks for contemporary art, for Filipino American art. And there's a lot of collectivities and movements in the Bay Area that we have to consider his work and his life and career as part of. One of which is, right, this clear genealogy of Bay Area abstract expressionists, minimalists, figurative artists. This is Leo Valador, who actually was Carlos's cousin, first cousin, and who is an incredibly important abstract artist in his own right, also understudied. So we have to think about Carlos in relationship to that. I think it's also important to think about Carlos in relationship to this community of independent and nonprofit arts institutes that are so central to keeping the heartbeat of San Francisco alive, and which, again, now are sadly losing their funding and possibly even closing down for good. In particular, Carlos had strong ties with Intersection for the Arts and the previous curator there, Kevin Chen, with again, the luggage store and the Tenderloin National Forest, which we luckily still have alive and well, as well as, fine arts galleries such as Paula Englum. She recently passed away. They had a very close relationship for many years. So again, Carlos moves in these various trajectories. We can't limit him to one kind of art history, and I think, again, this is why his work is so kind of fruitful and foundational for the ways in which I hope we can begin talking about Filipino American art today. This kind of process of articulating one's perspectives, not beholden to others, held in productive tension with collaborative and community-engaged art is how I want us to actually begin defining this idea or redefining this idea of Filipino American art. So instead of thinking about Filipino American art as a kind of fixed genre or fixed aesthetic, right? How can we actually begin to think of Filipino American art as a method or a way of approaching art making? Again, that is holistic, that takes into account individual practice as well as, right, community engaged teaching work and all these other things. So I've spoken enough, and I actually wanted to say again why I invited these 5 particular people who I think all offer us really amazing models for new Filipino American art, contemporary Filipino American art, not just in the Bay Area, but nationally. They were the first, when Mark asked me to do this, that I reached out to, and I'm really, really grateful that they said yes right away, no qualms. I didn't have to kind of beat any of them up to do it. So in terms of why I chose these 5 to talk to us today, I've known Eliza and Jenifer. First, I was introduced to them as a college student for their work with mail order brides, the collaborative. Oh, there's slideshows of you too. There, with Carlos. They formed around in the early 90s, and actually Carlos helped bring them together. And they're dynamic artists in their own right. Jenifer's illustrative pieces and her performative explorations opened my eyes, especially as a younger student, to histories of Filipino women in the homeland and the diaspora. I had the privilege, actually, of working with Eliza for nearly 2 years on a community engaged project with elders and seniors in the south of Market that was supported by BCA, and her conceptual video projections continue to make me think about memory and ephemerality in new ways. I'm excited to have her here. Cece Carpio's murals and collaborative works with the Trust Your Struggle Collective are exemplary models, I think, for activist and politically engaged art, public art. And Lordy Rodriguez and Michael Arcega's works, as different as they are incredibly exciting for me as a scholar interested in mapping and public memory as guides for reimagining Filipino American space and time. So all of them, through their individual art practice as well as through their teaching, Activism and collaborative and public projects exemplify, for me, new models of thinking, making, and talking about Filipino American art that break out of an identity-based politics or understanding of the category. Their varied practices continue to challenge us to think about how modes like abstraction, new media like video and installation, and conceptual performance really force us to develop new vocabularies of Filipino American art that don't rely on fixed identities and expected content, and instead push us to think about Filipino American art again as a method of holistic art making. Again, I'm really hoping that we can have a conversation about when this category actually has been useful for you and when hasn't it, right? I don't want to completely throw away the utility of other models of imagining Filipino American art, but I'm curious, at least to begin the conversation, if any of you wanted to talk about how each of you wrestle with this term and category, Filipino American art, or being called Filipino American artist, if there's any moments where it feels more or less useful to describe your work. And you can think about a relationship to the art market, but I'm hoping we can actually think about it more productively and not let the market dictate the ways that we move through the world. It's there. So they can go now. Who wants to go?
Is this thing on? Hi. First, I would like to sing Dahil Sa'yo. So I think I'll just start because I think of the group of us. I came of age taking an undergrad class with Carlos Villa in 1993, which is sort of that kind of perfect storm of that moment of the culture wars and a lot of really interesting conversations around identity politics. And I think for me also, being half Filipina and half Caucasian American and having grown up in a lot of different very hybrid circumstances, for me it was actually a really useful category. It wasn't something that I felt was a box in the slightest. I felt it was a way of a mode of sort of creative interrogation. Like I could look at ideas and systems in a way that I thought was really rich, and I could look at work in different kinds of contexts than within a sort of an elite sort of pretty white art world. So I found it to be enormously helpful in that regard. I understand a lot of people have resistance to some of the pigeonholing that can occur around identity politics, but I don't know, for me, I always found it liberating rather than constrictive.
In terms of exhibition, it was very helpful. One of the very first major shows I was a part of was a show here at the Asian Art Museum in Golden Gate Park. It was At Home and Abroad, which was, I think, the first international exhibit of Filipino artists and Filipino American artists. But it was difficult for me, because I grew up in Texas. I didn't have the opportunity or the luxury of growing up in the culture here. So I didn't, there's always this, I always have to kind of reconcile between making art based off of my own personal experiences or making art based off of being Filipino American. And sometimes they cross over and sometimes they don't. And so as I've been, exploring my work more, I think it's been more about understanding what are some of the criteria that I'm, I guess, judged on or representative of Filipino Americans. And I think that's, for me, in terms of my own process, is where I've been kind of playing with.
Can I follow, before other folks go, can you say a little bit about what some of those criteria are that you work through? Or at least for that show, right, At Home and Abroad, that first one. What was the criteria for selecting you or your participation? If you can remember that far back to the Dark Ages.
It wasn't that long ago. Was it? Oh, God. Okay.
What year was it?
It was 98. 98. Oh, wow. Hey. I don't know. I think that's probably a more apt question for the curators on why they chose me in the show. I mean, if anything, I was 20 years old, I think, at the time. So my main question was, what is my business being here with all of these other great artists in the show? But if anything, maybe it was because I grew up in I guess a culturally isolated area in Texas, and I'm an artist and I'm Filipino American. Perhaps it was a way to see an example of that and what kind of art could spring out of that. Not necessarily following any lineage of Filipino American art, but just seeing how those two identities can converge, artist and Filipino American.
So I'm probably the manong of the group. As far as Filipino American art and work, that was also pretty burgeoning. I graduated from Mills in '95. I met Carlos in '92, '93. Had really strong affinities with Moira Roth, who was really great in terms of academicizing multicultural work, and was really lucky to be part of a show called Memories of Overdevelopment, which that was in 1998, was another show of Filipino American artists. And, you know, when you look at the artists that they curated there, the only thing that I noticed that was common was, you know, everyone was Filipino or Filipino American. Definitely with that, I guess, would you say tag or label? There were many exhibition opportunities. I could say that the majority of my resume has been because of me being a Filipino American artist or queer. As far as my practice and my process goes, it's never ever been a conscious decision to you know, make work as a Filipino American artist. I think I was more topical and I was actually more inverted in sort of the exploration of a person in general. But I just so happened to be part of these different shows. I feel like because of my background. Yeah, I'm trying to really think about when I've been very conscious about my cultural background with the art practice. And I have to say, when Jenifer and Rianne and I get together as mail order brides, that was actually the first time I really, and we all three of us, or for me, had really, really thought about the topic and the issues and the identity of. So luckily, I have the collaborative practice with Jenifer and Rianne. We've been collaborating for many, many, many years. And so I have that sort of perspective of Filipino American art, work, being. And then I have my own practice. And now I'm sort of migrating over sort of new media, projection, kind of that type of work. So I think, I hope I answered the question.
Yeah.
I think my experience might be a little, I mean, everyone's experience is a little different, but I'm a street artist, and so the labeling sometimes is a little bit less, I mean, most of us don't even use our real name. You know, most of us don't even put our faces in it. So as far as my cultural identity, I think that played off a little bit more when, I mean, I also was a teacher. I taught both elementary, middle school, high school, to college levels, and done murals across the globe. So as far as my identity being relevant and significant within my art practice, I think is also part of like my methods of communication with the people I'm collaborating with. We collaborate, when I do murals, we collaborate with different communities, and knowing that the artwork that we're producing is not necessarily of our own, or not necessarily of my own, but rather belonging to the community in which we're collaborating with. The stories and the message are reflections of the people that we're working together with. So, and in those places, sometimes we have a long time to actually go and engage, but sometimes we have a very limited time to do the project And my experience and my identity and where I'm from is kind of more a mythology of being able to connect with the communities and being able to earn their trust. So definitely my heritage, being born and raised in the Philippines, raised by an indigenous grandmother in the farmland, and that is part of how I walk my path. I mean, it's kind of embedded in me whether or not I choose to put it out or however way to do it. So in some ways, that's kind of how I'm sharing a bit of myself to the folks and the people I'm working with allowed me to communicate with them and collaborate with them in a real way so that we can produce work together and share collective experience as we complete our project. But as far as like exhibitions and things, I mean, I think it just really, as Lordy had pointed out, depends on what the show is and what the project is about. And sometimes it's in the forefront of my practice, and sometimes it's just Cece doing her work. So I mean, it really does depends on the places and the people I'm working with and the type of work that I'm doing. So yeah, that's kind of my experience on that.
For me, the kind of label of Filipino American, or actually, I was born in the Philippines and immigrated when I was 10. I kind of found my way into art through graffiti and writing on walls, and kind of having a community of throughout all the way to high school, finding community in the Filipino and Filipino Americans that were around me, like that was comforting. And when I came to the Art Institute, Carlos, I didn't even know he was Filipino when I first met him, but somehow he was really warm, and I kind of gravitated to him, and I was like, oh, I thought you were Mexican, And that's funny because that just recently happened to me. Somebody thought I wasn't Filipino, and they were like, what, you're Filipino? I felt like I needed that kind of community that understood who I was and where I was coming from in terms of a shorthand, having Filipino families. There's a shorthand when you meet another Filipino or Filipino American. They know where you're coming from. And so through Carlos, he kind of helped me wrangle up a bunch of artists while I was at the Art Institute. We started a group called Grupo Alibata, and it was like Anthony Salgado, Christine Wilcox, Vicky Del Rosario, Nick Villando, and a couple other folks. And one of the a couple folks that he had us look at was Mob, Mail Order Brides, and I was like, I don't know, they're so cool. And then Paul Pfeiffer, equally cool. So he was presenting these models for me as a young artist that was eager to kind of find like-minded or like similar experientially, like having those same experiences. So really, in those terms, I found a kind of artistic home and a home base for my practice, where to work from and to not necessarily work about, but which I did also, but really like it rooted me in many meaningful ways.
Well, I'm interested actually in what you just said now, Mike, about the shorthand for Filipino American experience, because when I actually think about all of our biographies, none of us are local really to the Bay Area, right? I mean, yes and no, except for Jenifer, who you moved around quite internationally as throughout your childhood. Mike, Lordy, and Cece were born in the U.S. born in the Philippines, and then came here. Mike, you're from L.A. Lordy grew up in Texas, spent some time in New York, and Eliza, you're from San Diego, right? So I myself moved around a bit and only came to the Bay Area 2 years ago, right? So I wonder if, when we're talking about this shorthand, how our own experiences kind of betray this idea that there's some kind of shared experience. And if it's something actually about less the upbringing and more about being in the Bay Area, right? And expectations maybe, or shared history specific to the Bay Area legacy of activist struggle, the Asian American movement, or even just the availability for us to teach classes in Filipino American art or Asian American studies at the universities here. All of the universities and the public community college have Filipino American studies classes, which don't happen really anywhere else, not even in LA, right? So I'm to the extent that they are here. So I wonder, right, if there's something about the Bay Area that lets us sometimes believe that, I don't know, there's more of a cohesive Filipino.
No, I think it's absolutely located here. This is the epicenter. I mean, I don't think any place else in the United States or the world is there this kind of density of, I think, Filipino American scholarship and creative energy, and I think a willingness to sort of engage. There's the legacy of places like, the International Hotel and Kearney Street Workshop for sure, that I think have also facilitated that. And it's amazing, obviously, like the Ethnic Studies program at SF State, there's so many kinds of overlapping scholars and artists and mentor figures, and I think there's also just that general thing. You get like 2 Filipinos in a room, suddenly there's like 20. So there's a way in which this kind of community or collaborative ethos, I think, is embedded in a number of our practices. Mike, when you were mentioning Grupo Alibata, I was immediately thinking, well, of course, like mail order brides also were at one point part of Diwa Arts, which was a very seminal collaborative group here in the 90s, which was Johanna Potig, Helio Batle, Romel Padilla, Rene de Guzman, Leo Bersamina, Rico Reyes, Maria Medjua. There was a lot of folks. So, and I know for me as a young undergrad, I got jumped into that group pretty early because the food was really good. And I think as a Filipino American, I came to expect good meals as part of my collaborative aesthetic. And the
shared
Mail-Order
cultural
Brides,
experience.
which certainly continue that to this day. We eat before we do anything else.
Which is
So, yeah, I feel like there's a way in which it's easier for that to happen here than probably a lot of other places.
And is that a good thing? The food is good. Oh, the food's always good. But in terms of your practice, your individual practice, you're moving in the world, right? It's amazing, these kinds of opportunities like you're mentioning, right, that you had to show in these group shows, to be asked to be part of these projects, but were there moments where it was limiting as well? And do these opportunities actually still even exist? I would even think for the next generation of artists.
Actually, I'm curious, do you think that's related to, I guess, a geographic density of Filipino Americans in one area? Because I'm looking at areas in New York where the Filipino communities are spread between Jersey and Queens. In Houston, we did have a small Filipino community. It's much bigger now, but it's very spread out. Same thing in LA, from what I remember there. I mean, there's multiple communities of Filipinos. And here, it all stemmed from Daly City. Of course, there's satellite areas now, like Vallejo. And what?
Daly City came after 65. It was Manila Town.
Sorry. Manila Town. Thank you for the correction.
Just correcting that. And
Thank you very
correction.
much. But yeah, I mean, but there is this one singular location. I mean, is it related to that?
I don't know. I mean, I grew up in San Diego, where there's Manila Mesa, right? And the Filipino art in San Diego, I'm not aware of. God, I grew up there. I born in '68, and so I grew up there, and I don't remember the art happening. It was all about Chicano art. It was about lowriders and cholos. So if we're talking about density, then why haven't there been like several iterations of Filipino arts groups, say in New York or maybe LA? And I don't know. I think it's
back in on this one.
Huh? Go for it.
And then I'm going to stop talking too much. I think it's also there's a density of artist-run spaces and a different kind of community aesthetic in the Bay Area, because if you go to places like New York or LA that are much more market-driven in their artist communities, I think there's a way in which that has actually suppressed a lot of sort of identity-driven kinds of collaborations. And I think here it's always been a historically open place for that.
And I also just want to bring up, at least in my generation, not that I'm a lot younger than a lot of the other folks here, but I mean, the hip-hop generation here in the Bay Area, the Filipinos kind of like
Run the game.
Killed it. You know, whether it was DJing, b-boying, and all this stuff, and graffiti artists and being part of that. I mean, folks really took lead in that culture, or, you know, was running stuff in that culture. And I think within my generation, it allowed folks to take part of something, to belong to some place, to be able to do something. And definitely you see remnants of that. And you see a lot of like that generation still playing off the type of art that they're producing, the type of music that they're singing, that, you know, there's definitely influences of that culture that has influenced a very vast majority of the Filipinos here in the Bay. Yeah.
I also felt that kind of interdisciplinarity that was welcoming in terms of just really keeping the kind of Filipino community tight. I remember as a group, Grupo Alibata, like we were encouraged to go to SF State and take classes because they had like Filipino American art history. But we also got close to Tongue in a Mood as like two groups that were together. So here we are, we have theater and visual arts kind of mixing together and having this kind of this dialogue. And I think that maybe there was just like a synergy in the Bay Area, or at least as you know, I only know really of San Francisco during that time, but you can enter as a Filipino American the community and immediately be in the network, and you can pretty much latch on any kind of arts that you were half interested or wholly interested in. So, I don't know, I think there was just, I don't know.
Yeah, so that makes me think of kind of two things. One is, what's happening in terms of street artists and, musicians, DJs in that community, right? In terms of what people are still making, still actively doing with hip hop crews, even still PCNs, right? That go on every single year at every school, which are really incredible performances. So that's kind of happening in more kind of, the Filipino Cultural Night, several nights a year at the end of the school year, where students put on various kinds of artistic, dance-driven performances, right, of Filipino cultural dances and also new interpretations of stuff. Sorry. See, I forget that everyone in the Bay Area doesn't all know these things. So this kind of thing that's happening in street art, as well as more gallery-driven kind of artists and work. Not that I want to recreate that split between these things, but in terms of, again, some of these exhibition opportunities for galleries and shows seem to not be as present now, and I'm wondering if any of you could speak to that, or also just your own process how you're creating, what you're making, right? If thinking through the kinds of identity politics that you did in your early career, say, are as important to you now, or what you're thinking about now, right? That was kind of rambly, sorry.
I've been thinking about that question a lot, because I think when you're an artist in your 20s, you're immediately dealing with identity no matter where you're coming from, because you're trying to figure out what kind of artist you are. And when it comes to exhibitions, as a young artist, you should, I guess, try to take advantage of many opportunities that come your way. Of course, be mindful of what those opportunities can mean for your career later on, whether or not they add to it or take away. But I think because of being Filipino American, there is a certain caution that the creators that I've seen or I've worked with before in labeling Filipino American artists or the kind of aesthetic that can come out of that. So I think I've been lucky in that regard. But still, I never said no. But there's also a point of pride too. I didn't grow up with a very strong Filipino community, so any opportunity that I could show with other Filipino American artists was a way for me to connect to some community that I probably didn't have growing up.
I mean, I guess I'd like to speak to what you're saying in terms of showing and opportunity and sort of putting yourself out there. When I was in my 20s, I took whatever I could just because, right? Not really thinking about how it would impact my career. And I guess this could like overlay with the whole sort of the market-driven art making process, which my work is not. Never has been, or could be, I wish. But it's really interesting because though being part of the Filipino American art scene in the Bay Area, when you kind of throw yourself out elsewhere, I had the opportunity to live in a couple other countries like Buenos Aires and Mexico. It was really interesting how that, in some ways, didn't matter. They looked at your work and they either liked it or they didn't. Or you talk about the content and you slightly convince them of what the content is. And that to me I found fascinating. And so it poses a question, is the idea of Filipino American art important because I'm in the Bay Area? I don't know.
I just like to piggyback on that. I think I find it interesting that when you travel in different places, your identity didn't matter, where I found that it actually what brought attention to me because I was different. I was out in some place that barely talked English and was trying to figure who I was and where I am. And so having to explain where I come from, where I'm at, made me different and made me stand out in some way. So it did matter in that sense. But as far as the actual work itself, I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely about the quality of the work and what it is that you're producing. I think it's interesting because just now still getting myself familiar on what Filipino American art is as a Filipino living in the Bay, just generally because I didn't really, in my young 20s, which was like not so long ago, I was just kind of running the streets. It wasn't like installations and galleries per se. So it's a different type of experience and labeling that I feel like I've gotten. And what I feel like stood out for me more was like kind of like my immigration experience influenced a lot more of my work as far as being influenced by different environment and places and people who I've had a chance to meet, but always kind of going back to where I'm from because essentially that's what people would consistently ask. Because I do have this nomadic practices. So people are always kind of like, where are you from? And being Filipino, being born and raised in the Philippines was immediately a part of how I identified myself because it was easy, it was simple. Instead of trying to tell them about the last 10 cities I've lived in, per se.
Well, I've definitely considered a lot of fears around being pigeonholed and being kind of labeled as just a Filipino or Filipino American, and being kind of put in that place of being like an ethnic-specific practitioner and fighting that expectations. But to be honest, I've never had the tag Filipino American to be negative. It's never affected me negatively. It was, but that fear of being placed in that has driven me to consider other means of looking at my practice. And culture has changed since the 90s when we kind of came up and kind of started understanding ourselves. Initially I started making work about being a kind of coming from an oppressed / colonized culture, and eventually I started moving away from that and thinking about somebody who had immigrated, and now I'm making work that is being kind of critical of, and rather than being apart from the culture where I live, I am kind of insisting that I am part of this culture, and who are you? Who are my neighbors, and who are the people that I'm occupy this territory with? So in a sense, I've always inverted that expectation of being the colonized and being the kind of under somebody that's under the thumb of another government or something like that, but rather pretending to be like a conquistador, or a conquistador, but I was actually a conquistador. But making this flip where, I will pretend to be the dominant, but do it in a kind of humorous and critical way. But it's the tag being a Filipino or Filipino American has never, I feel, hurt my practice at all.
I question how many people's practices it has hurt, period. And I feel like so many artists who are working from some position of I guess marginality in the generally homogenous sort of bougie 1%-y art world, I mean, we're all kind of, we're sort of like, there's a Stockholm syndrome thing that takes over, like, oh, there must be something wrong with us, that we are not more universal in the way that we participate in. And that's where I feel like that's actually a failing of this incredibly problematic structure rather than, what our work should and can be in conversation with. And I feel like what's been so nice about, an increasingly globalized art world, for all the neoliberal nonsense that's part of that too, there's a way in which our work is part of other kinds of globalized conversations now, that it isn't fixed in some weird little ghettoized box. And I think that that's sort of the interesting moment that's been, I think, increasingly been more evident in the past few years.
And I mean, I think a part of it isn't, any failure on the part of the artist, right, to making new work, as we've seen with all of your work and others, right? You're not operating from, right, a marginalized position. You're actively creating new modes, new models, right, new ways of imagining just whatever it is you're imagining. I think it largely is a failure of the arts establishment, the arts institution, writers, curators, scholars like myself, to even having a vocabulary to talking about it. I mean, I'm just thinking about all of these horrible reviews of the Venice Biennale that are coming out. They're horrendous. They're just about the same as the 1993 Whitney Biennial. They're incredibly racist. They see nothing but, African exploitation because, the curator's African, and all of this work that, God forbid, is making us think about, things like trafficking or anything that's not, real art, right? God forbid any of these artists actually talk about social issues at all, right? I mean, you look at the art, you go on Instagram, you see what's actually being produced at the Biennale, and that's absolutely not true. Right? It's absolutely a failure of imagination when you see a brown artist, when you see a queer artist, when you see a feminist artist, to thinking about their work in any kind of imaginative way, right? So, if anything, I mean, this is why I think these dialogues are so important, is to really, show folks that what we are doing, right, what you are all doing is so much more, right? It is, again, about creation.
And I think it just depends on how complicit you want to be with the market, and that's its own sort of structured system. I think, Eliza and I, when we were doing our mail order brides work, we, showed several times with a commercial gallery where nothing sold because, shocker, there aren't a lot of collectors for 3 Filipina clown women. But I think our egos are enough intact that we didn't look at that as some failure of our, on our behalf in terms of what we made. It was just like, oh, collectors just haven't figured us out yet. If you're out there, we're waiting.
I think we're almost done with our portion before opening it up for Q&A, but one thing I wanted to talk about a bit more was kind of, collaboration and teaching, since all of you, more or less all of you, all of you teach in various ways and or have done collaborative projects. Capitalism is over, right? Other kinds of public interventions, and then clearly Cece's work as well in various kinds of avenues. And I'm wondering how you could talk about that in relationship to your individual practice, how much you, right? Incorporate these various models, right? Yeah, collaboration and stuff, teaching and stuff. You could talk about that.
Talk about collaboration because I'm not a teacher. A couple workshops, but I wouldn't call
The
that
high
teaching.
school kids loved Eliza when she ran the workshops for them.
But collaboration, I would say, is I'm sort of I have several hats. I have my individual practice, then I have the brides, and then I have a few other collaborations that occur, and I clearly love to collaborate. And I think it's super important to my practice. It's sort of similar to having the day job in the art practice world for me. It gives me sort of a way to reflect what I'm doing in both worlds. So essentially the day job is I'm a techie. I fix computers. And then I do my other full-time job is being an artist, and I have this other realm where I can also collaborate with folks. And, collaborating with the brides is super great because then I get like two other heads to like bounce off against. And we all have very different perspectives and approaches, and we get to like sort of vibe on that. But then in the same respect, I get to vibe on my art practice while I'm at work, and vice versa. So I think for me, collaboration is sort of a way to expand yourself, but I just feel really lucky to be able to have kept it up for so long because it's a lot of work.
And your practice is so kind of dematerialized and conceptual, your video work.
Yeah.
Now, the collaboration is an interesting counterpoint for you for that. The things you've done with Daily Slots, putting messages in the various newsstands around San Francisco, right? Your kind of intervention actions with Capitalism Is Over at the time, and involvement with Clarion Mural Alley, right? It's an interesting counterpoint. I think.
It really is, and it's sort of how you need the opposite or something else to sort of push up against to actually reify yourself. That's sort of what I do.
Collaboration and teaching, I love it. It's hard as hell. I can't lie. I think every project I've had its drama, with all its grits and glory, and I feel a little bit like, this is a kind of funny reference, but Smeagol from Lord of the Rings sometimes. Just in terms of like, as an artist, there is a little bit of like, you kind of have to be a little bit selfish to have the time to produce work, to think and imagine and to vision what it is that you want to do. And as a teacher, as an educator, you kind of have to be selfless and be able to give yourself all out. And as a muralist, you have to do both. Because you have to design it, but at the end of the day, although sometimes your name's on the wall, knowing that that piece of work is essentially not yours. And I'm definitely fed by it. I'm definitely fed, and I've learned so much. It's rewarding to be able to do work with variety of communities and communicate through borders and languages, through painting images on the wall. There's something really amazing and rewarding and about the work. But as I said, each work each project comes with its own story. And it becomes a collective experience through the process of creating the project. And I've cried on walls. It could be really tough, but it could also be really amazing knowing that you can walk away from a place, having had an exchange, and them gifting you with their company, with their presence, with their skills, with their talents, and being able to leave a place with a mark, knowing that you've done some work together. So it's amazing, and I definitely see myself continuing doing this work, but it's definitely, I'm not gonna romanticize and say it's easy, because it's never really that easy.
Actually, I want to talk about it being not easy. So I was always that kid that, whenever there was a new movie, especially in the 90s when there was like a new comic book movie came out, I'd be the first one to watch it, and I would tell everybody in my neighborhood what the movie was about. And, like, if you want to know about Batman, you come to me and I'll talk to you about it, right? Or the new comic book. This is my kind of thing. But, it was really about how I would consume culture. And in my own practice, it's a lot about how I consume culture or even what that means. And so when I'm teaching, that's what I kind of feel like I am. I'm like that guy who knows about this one little thing, and I could tell you about it. I currently teach at San Jose State. There you go, there's one of them right there. just graduated right there. For me, teaching is like that. It's that thing. The one thing that I think, that part makes it easy. The thing that I think that makes it hard, and unfortunately what teaching is kind of become, is it's an active assessment. And, of course, we have to assess the growth of our students and see whether or not they are kind of accepting the information we're giving them. But that, for me, is the hardest part, is the assessing, the grading. I prefer just to go over and talk about all the fun stuff that, we're teaching. Because, we're all art teachers. Art is a lot of fun, and this is what should be transmitted to the students. Other teachers.
Yeah, teaching. I want to talk about collaboration first. I really don't like collaborating.
That's right.
It's hard as shit. And pretty much every single collaboration I've participated in, maybe it's me, hasn't worked out quite well. Like it doesn't work out as, the work works out really well, I think, but I feel like there's a strain on emotion. So I don't think, I'm just pretty much voicing out my, not my stance against collaboration, because I think it's great, and like what everything that Cece says is true, but it's not for everybody. I feel like I'm more of in truth, as much as I'd love to be like a person who loves collaborating, I'm really a studio artist who likes to make, and likes to make mostly in isolation. And, I get into the making part of it. So I just wanted to voice out that not everybody's into collaborating. But in terms of teaching, teaching is something I really gleaned a lot from Carlos. The idea he mentioned I took several classes with him as an undergrad, but the idea of serious at play was really something that came prominent in my development, but also that teaching can be attached and associated to a more holistic practice where you take in and you give out. And my position as a teacher, I teach at SF State, is that somebody who empowers young artists, and that's, I in terms of encouraging their practice and instilling a kind of play, but a serious play, right? Like a more rigorous practice that questions and is critical. And that's I feel like that's my role with whatever I can't achieve in my own practice, I could maybe achieve in that capacity for my students to be able to question larger and broader things. So, and they go hand in hand. And they do. There is a give and take that happens there, and sometimes you give too much and it drains you too much, and that balance is something that you need to kind of negotiate within your capabilities and your strengths and your weaknesses, and to be really kind of to acknowledge what those weaknesses are, to acknowledge where your limits are, and that's I find teaching to still be pretty difficult, but at the same time it has its rewards.
I'm like, where am I in this? I like having a solo practice, but I like collaborating. I actually like it. Eliza and I have had knockdown drag-outs more than once. There's something about bickering as part of an art practice that has its merits, and because sometimes you get to a place you could not get if you were controlling the thing only on your own terms, at your own pace. And when you have that friction with somebody else or a group of other people, lots of unpredictable things come out of that I personally enjoy, even when I don't. Right, I think going back to the 90s, not long after I met Carlos, and one of the first things I really learned from Carlos was this idea that your role as an artist is not just to be sort of a solitary, studio-driven, creature. And that's fine if that is part of your practice, but, you can also be an activist, and you can be a street scholar, and you can be, an educator, and you can be a community member. And that was super critical for me. Because not long after that, I went straight into my first, teaching gigs. Just while I was still in college, I started working with middle schoolers through Southern Exposure's, summer program. So basically, my earliest teaching experiences were with super squirrely, crazy little kids. And then I ended up moving into becoming a, public high school teacher here in San Francisco for a number of years. And so for me, this idea of, and then eventually taught a few of you out here in the audience. What's up, Anthony? And I think that there's something about that thing of having grown up as an educator, working predominantly with sort of, urban kids of color, and then still sort of traversing this art world, which is absolutely none of those folks, that, is this incredible split for me in terms of like, what is going on here, and why is there not a more porous boundary between these worlds? And so for me, it's still a porous boundary. Like, I try to sort of create as much crossover as I can in both the art that I make and the teaching that I do, so that people don't feel excluded from one world or the other.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I was hoping... One word. Oh, where'd it go? One word or one name of someone that is exciting you right now as you move forward in your art practice. Someone or something, one word. 2 words, 1 to 2 words. Colors, shape. Kara Walker, I don't know. Too hard? Too much? We can go back to that. Someone do it.
Yeah, after Q&A?
Oh, we're going to ask the one word at the end. That'll be closeout. Mark, did you want to open up the Q&A for folks?
Yeah, actually. Do we have any questions to start the conversation and turn it over to you guys?
Hi. My question is, I have 2 questions that are related. So one is, how do you deal, from your experience as artists, how do you deal with unfamiliar audience or audience that does not necessarily understand the content of your work initially? And have you gotten a lot of pressure to be more universal, and how do you deal with that?
I guess I'll start. Hello. Yeah, I personally deal with that question often. So how does an artist who has a lot of subtexts that are sometimes culturally specific get that across to a broad range of audiences? I'm kind of reframing it to the way I want to hear it, and it's a tricky thing because in my work I do have a lot of punning as part of my practice, and it's been there in the inception of my my work, and when dealing with an audience that doesn't speak the same language, that doesn't speak English, or isn't interested in those things, one has to rely on other strengths of the work. So maybe it's in the craft of the thing, or maybe it's just in the strict kind of visual pleasure that the viewer can get. Not everything is going to be transparent, and I hope it never becomes transparent, because there goes the mystery. If it was so blatantly obvious, it wouldn't be interesting. So I hope that there would be some missing elements in the work that will forever be a question, even for myself too as a maker. Yeah, sometimes I'm okay with it not being understood wholly.
I think with the type of work that I do, I deal a lot with popular education, being able to have images and illustration that could communicate to the masses. So I think it's the other way around for me sometimes, that when it is kind of in the art world scene, I have to then break it down a little bit more. I mean, now in this current time where street art, graffiti art is kind of like a popular thing and is accepted in so many different realms, it's still kind of very particular places that could consider it, I don't know the hierarchy of per se, but like high art per se, you know? And I've just come to acceptance that you just can't please everyone, and that's okay. Like, I'm not trying to, you know? But as far as trying to explain the work, I think for me, it's just really knowing who my audience is and what it is, my intent in creating the work that I'm doing in the first place. Because a lot of the work that we do produce is not necessarily meant, I mean, some of them, we do a lot of exhibitions and shows, but when we're doing collaboration, sometimes it's a little bit more focused on the actual collaborative process and the people that we're collaborating with. So that then becomes my target audience, and prioritizing them as far as what the work is going to be.
Great. Any more additional questions? I'm sorry. I just wanted to give more people opportunity.
Hi, I was just wondering, and Michael touched on this a little bit earlier, because you're not necessarily pegged into a hole when you're dealing outside of like the Filipino American community here, because like you said, you know, they're like, oh, I thought you were Mexican. When you work outside of kind of those shows that are already labeling you a certain way, how do you balance like identifying yourself and wanting the people who are observing your art to know about your life and how that affects your art versus just letting it stand alone?
When exhibiting in a non kind of culturally or racially specific show, that's I wholeheartedly welcome that, because I as a practitioner, I identify primarily as an artist that is informed by my Filipino American background or Filipino heritage. So I actually would love it if it was completely just normalized, where everybody, like, where it didn't matter, but that's a kind of that's not gonna ever happen, I don't think. But there's also some, like, I love that we have our differences, that there is a diversity in voices. So I feel like it's okay. Like, I like being just an artist. Does that answer it? Follow up by Sanaz?
I guess I would just say that, speaking for Eliza, I'm not speaking for you, you're speaking for you. But, I make paintings and I make drawings and I make public art and I do performance work and I do video. And so I feel like it's kind of hard to pigeonhole me anyway. So in that way, it doesn't matter. And I also think there's a very American framing to the way we talk about some of this idea of pigeonholing. And the more that I'm increasingly showing in Asia, and it's just not even a thing. Like, they're kind of like, oh yeah, she's kind of part Asian, but it doesn't. It's not. The conversation is so different that I think that there's a way in which, if we situate it outside of this very Americanized idea around identity and race and the ways in which we talk about it, the conversation immediately just sort of disrupts.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much, guys. Amazing. As an artist who also works within a culturally specific realm because of where I was born and my past life experience, I think that learning from your community, like the Filipino American community, has been incredibly rewarding since I've moved to the Bay Area.
You're welcome.
Yes. So I guess I wanted to kind of continue on the question of teaching and thinking about that in terms of the audiences that you're engaging with. So perhaps your audience will have Filipino Americans in it, but most of the time it's a much larger audience from many different walks of life. And wondering if you, because of your lived experiences and where your work comes from, if you feel any kind of sense of responsibility to speak for your community, on behalf of your community, to represent it in some way as a means to perhaps kind of bridge gaps. And I wonder if you could just speak to that briefly. That would be great.
Sorry, I got the mic again. I also teach Filipino American arts, so there's a whole other level with me around this stuff. No, I guess I feel a responsibility to have an honest sort of conversation around something, but I don't necessarily think it needs to be like role modelism per se. I mean, like the bride stuff, we're just kind of goons. So, I mean, there's a way in which what we do is pretty ridiculous and inappropriate, and our mothers do not understand us at all. And that's okay. They still seem to enjoy the fact that we're wearing dresses and wigs. So I think there's just a way in which, to what degree does your audience really, want to invest in engaging with you too, right? So I guess there's that.
I feel like my approach with my students is to kind of abstract my personal history, and there's a lot of different steps that I've taken in the past that allows me to be empathetic to a lot of different types of people. So I try to bring those experiences in, not just as a Filipino American, but as somebody who was kind of part of a rich family at one point in the Philippines that's no longer, and then as an immigrant, as a graffiti artist, as all of these, like as somebody who relocated to San Francisco, as like all of these different people who I had inhabited in the past, I try to kind of use those things to help empower my students and to help them kind of find their path. So I think it's by dismantling my persona or my person and my histories, I'm able to kind of find a thing that hopefully will lead them to succeed.
I wanted to follow up on that too. I think I still have a hard time with that. Because when I go home to the Philippines, I think folks back home has the notion of what Filipino American is and what it's supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be representing, like I'm representing the whole Bay Area or something. And then when I come here back from the Philippines, I think folks kind of like expect me to talk about like everything that's happening in the Philippines as if I'm supposed to know all of it. And also just reminding everyone that being Filipino is not a homogeneous experience. Like my experience is different from Jen, from Lordy, and it's not like a one thing that could be, oh, this is how we do it. We all eat lumpias, like whatever it is, and sometimes I do struggle with that because depending on who my audience is, and sometimes there are assumptions of who I am, what I'm representing, the communities I'm representing. And I think just being able to be honest and navigate those particular situations of really specifying that this is me, Cece, coming from this experience, and I am Filipino, and I do live there, and I have these things, but my experience is not of everyone's.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you for being up there. I have many questions, but let's see if I can. The first question I had was, you talked about the specialness of the Bay Area and the Filipino American artists here. Have you had experiences with other areas like Seattle, Hawaii? What are the Filipino American experiences there for artists?
Oh, are you asking me?
All of you.
All of you. You've shown out there, I'm a bad art historian. I'm a bad Asian American, bad Filipino American. I am. I didn't grow up in this place. I didn't take Asian American studies, but I am interested in particular thematics. And so the work that I've actually investigated the most by artists of Filipino American descent are less geographically based in terms of studying every single artist from a particular community, and more thematic. So in various ways I've written about mostly all of your work because of the ways in which they deal with a thematic of space in relationship to urban redevelopment in the Bay Area. So I'm familiar with the artists out here and other artists, non-Filipino American artists, whose work I think helps illuminate the particular condition of communities of color, Black, Latino, queer, Filipino American in the Bay Area. So I think the artists are actually better equipped to talking about maybe folks that you've come across in other cities and places. I mean, I know Trisha Legasso is a curator in Hawaii and doing really amazing shows out in Hawaii for Filipino and Filipino diasporic artists.
Yeah, Trisha is, she's kind of like the connection, the tie between San Francisco and Hawaii. And having worked in Hawaii and having worked in other places, I think that there is this commonality among kind of either immigrants or Filipino Americans in those areas. Like I was recently in Bahrain. It's not so recent anymore, a couple of years. And that was probably the most unusual situation for me, to be in the Gulf with Filipinos, because the idea of Filipino American doesn't exist. I was immediately just a Filipino, and fortunately I speak Tagalog, so I was able to just be Filipino. And it was in a way, I found it to be very comforting to strip the history of not comforting, but it was an odd thing. It was like being in the Philippines, but being in this very stratified social context where Filipino American doesn't. It was interesting. It was odd, but in terms of art and how it was being received, it does become neutralized in a way when you go into areas where the cultural specificity of your work doesn't matter. I mean, I don't know. I think this is the question. Maybe it doesn't. It needs to be able to stand apart from it being culturally specific. The work needs to be strong enough that it could transcend that stripping of the race. You know, I don't know. Maybe that's crazy.
Go ahead.
Something you said earlier, Mike, in terms of teaching, is that looking at our identities as Filipino American in relation to our work and in the relation to the community that we're living in, is that it affords us the ability to find points of relation for other people and other races. So as I was growing up in Texas, even though I didn't have a lot of other Filipino artists in my community, I was able to relate to the Mexican American artists, the African American artists, like all of these other races, and because we were all able to find similarities in the way we approached our identities. But the thing is that it's not purely related to minority races; it's also related to all people. As artists, we're all afraid of being pigeonholed, no matter what kind of artist you are, right? No matter what kind of race you are. And so we're always struggling with these kind of labels. And by breaking apart and critically looking at how we as artists and Filipino American artists approach our work, gives us the ability to kind of look at the whole structure of labels and how they how we relate to them, I guess.
I was actually just thinking about the separation of Filipino communities abroad, Filipino communities elsewhere, and I started flowing into like group shows that I've been in, which is Filipino shows like in Seattle or Asian American show, and looking at the work, there was definitely a range of aesthetic issues and ways in which they express themselves. But I don't think I've ever immersed myself in a Filipino or Filipino American community outside of the Bay Area. I've met several Filipino Americans, but like on an individual basis. And then back to the travels to like Buenos Aires, there is a very small population of Filipinos, but it was, they were working for diplomats, and art was not a discussion, it was religion. That's how we got together. And, you know, the way I kind of embedded myself with them was that I was doing a research paper on Filipinos in Argentina at the time, which was in 2007, where the financial crisis was terrible, and I just didn't understand why they would go to a country that just was not rich. But it was really interesting because the arts that they were talking about were the traditional arts, the dances, and then also religious, you know, gospel singing or singing together, and food, of course. So I would like to in the future see and feel how, or if that exists, Filipino American art groups in other cities, and how they connect, and why haven't we connected with them?
So I just wanted to still ask you to give me one word or one name of what's exciting or interesting, or just, you know, I'm curious to know what's on your mind these days. And I did want to, Mike Arcega has his opening tomorrow and through this weekend at Recology, but I also wanted to mention all of our panelists have exciting shows already open or opening soon. Jenifer will be having is part of a show at the Silver Lens Gallery in Manila in July. So if you are in the Filipinas, you should go. Lordy will be showing a massive work, I think, at the Nevada Museum of Art in August in Reno. So gambling and art. Filipinos, you love that, right? Eliza is currently in a Trans Bay show showing both at Random Parts Gallery in Oakland and at Incline Gallery in SF, a group show called The Dissidents, Displaced, and Outliers, and it's a show on art, tech, and gentrification in the Bay Area. And Cece on July 11th will be exhibiting with the Trust Your Struggle Collective at the Soul Collective Gallery in Sacramento. So all of them are doing super exciting things that I hope you all look at this summer. One word. What's exciting to you right now? Or what are you thinking about?
EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, surveillance, and what is happening with the government and spying on everything we do. I always think about that. We are watched.
My word is trans, although that's technically not a word in and of itself. Transmedia, transgender, transnational, transcultural. I think that's where I'm excited to see the most new growth happening, and especially in the arts and in, yeah.
Thank you. No pressure, guys. Cookies works. Birthday parties, I don't know. Nothing's inspiring you, Lordy? Mad Max?
Well, all right. Well,
pop culture?
TV.
Yeah, TV.
What have you watched, Lordy?
Yeah. Arrow?
All right. Yeah, okay. Comic book TV shows, I am a big fan of right now, but for a specific reason. You know, I think comics are contemporary mythologies, and there's something quite interesting about that. I mean, the same way that we mythologize certain iconic figures in history, we're doing that right now with these fictional characters. I think that's quite interesting. On the other end of that is reality television, where we have all of these people that are being mythologized for I don't know what, but it's just fascinating to watch them become icons in a way. So that's my spectrum of influence.
I just want to use this chance to say Carnival weekend.
Yeah.
This Sunday, I'm pitting Float, 51, Sambache. Check it out. There it is. That was my little pitch.
Mine is summer and nesting.
What? Summer and nesting?
Yeah.
Oh. Anything else, Mark?
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And if you enjoyed tonight or if you have any recommendations, there are surveys either around here or back there. So please, if you have a moment, let us know what you thought. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you all for coming.